Hey there, truth seekers. Today we're cracking open one of humanity's oldest stories, Noah's Flood. You know, that wholesome Sunday school tale about a righteous dude, some floating zoo animals, and God hitting the reset button because humanity got a little too spicy. Cute story. Except here's the kicker. What if literally everything you've been told about it is either half true, sanitized for mass consumption, or flat out wrong? What if the real story involves cosmic disasters, advanced ancient tech, and genetic manipulation that makes modern science look like kid stuff? Buckle up, because we're about to torch the fairy tale version and dig into what actually might have happened. Before we dive into the rabbit hole, smash that like button if you're ready to question everything you thought you knew about ancient history. And drop a comment below. Where in the world are you watching from? I'm genuinely curious who's brave enough to take this journey with me. Because trust me, once you see what we're about to uncover, from underwater cities that shouldn't exist to DNA evidence that science can't explain, there's no going back to the simple version they taught you in church. So let's get one thing straight right now. This isn't your grandma's bedtime Bible story. This is about cataclysms, conspiracies, and civilizations that got wiped from existence, and the uncomfortable possibility that it could all happen again. Ready to see how deep this flood really goes? Let's dive in. So here's where things get properly wild. Forget the Sunday school version where God just cranks up the rain machine for 40 days because people were being naughty. The actual evidence points to something far more terrifying, and frankly, way more cinematic. We're talking fire from the sky, ice sheets the size of continents melting in what amounts to a geological eye blink, and tsunamis that would make every disaster movie you've ever seen look like a kiddie pool splash. Welcome to the real story of what probably caused the Great Flood. And spoiler alert, it involves a cosmic sucker punch that nearly ended humanity before we really got started. Let's start with what the ancients actually wrote down, because unlike your average modern citizen who can barely remember what they had for breakfast, these people were obsessed with recording catastrophic events. The Sumerians, arguably the first folks to get really serious about writing things down instead of just passing stories around the campfire, left us tablets describing something they called the fire that fell from heaven. Not a metaphor. Not poetic license. They literally described flames raining from the sky before the waters came. The Egyptians had similar accounts in their temple inscriptions, talking about a great star that brought destruction. The Maya, thousands of miles away across an ocean that supposedly nobody crossed back then, recorded almost identical stories about celestial fire preceding a world-ending flood. Now, either all these civilizations got together for some ancient conspiracy convention to coordinate their stories, which would be impressive considering they didn't have Zoom calls, or they all witnessed the same absolutely catastrophic event. Here's where modern science crashes the party and actually backs up these ancient accounts, which has got to be awkward for the academics who've spent decades dismissing this stuff as mythology. Around 12,800 years ago, give or take a few centuries because ancient dating isn't exactly precise, something massive smashed into Earth's atmosphere. We're talking about a comet, or more likely a swarm of comet fragments, that decided Earth looked like a good target. The evidence for this is buried in a layer of sediment found across multiple continents, a layer that contains microscopic diamonds, iridium, platinum, and other materials that only form under the kind of extreme pressure and heat you get when space rocks hit atmosphere at tens of thousands of miles per hour. It's like finding the geological equivalent of a crime scene, complete with fingerprints that say extraterrestrial impact all over them. This event has a fancy scientific name because scientists love making things sound boring, even when they're describing the near annihilation of life on Earth. They call it the Younger Dryas Impact Event, named after a flower called Dryas that suddenly appeared across Europe during this period. The flower shows up in the fossil record because it's a cold climate plant, and it spread everywhere fast because, surprise, the world suddenly got freezing cold again right after it had been warming up nicely from the last ice age. Imagine the climate equivalent of someone turning the thermostat way up. You're finally comfortable and taking off your mammoth fur coat, and then bam, some cosmic jerk turns it back down to Arctic blast mode. That's basically what happened, except instead of being mildly annoying like when your roommate messes with the AC, this killed off a significant chunk of Earth's megafauna and nearly wiped out humanity. The timing here is absolutely crucial, so pay attention because this is where the puzzle pieces start clicking together in a way that should make you question everything. The Younger Dryas period began almost exactly 12,800 years ago. We can date this with ice cores, sediment layers, and other geological evidence that doesn't care about anyone's religious or academic biases. It lasted for about 1,200 years, which in geological terms is like a snap of the fingers, but in human terms is multiple generations living in an ice age hellscape when they thought spring was finally coming. The planet had been steadily warming. Ice sheets were retreating. Early human civilizations were probably getting comfortable and building semi-permanent settlements. Then this cosmic impact happens, and suddenly it's back to survival mode. The temperature dropped by about 15 degrees Celsius in some regions, not gradually over centuries, but within decades. That's not climate change, that's climate catastrophe. Now let's talk about what happens when a massive comet or asteroid decides to play demolition derby with Earth, because this is where the flood story starts making a lot more sense. The impact, or more accurately, impacts, since we're probably talking about multiple fragments hitting different locations, would have released energy equivalent to millions of nuclear weapons. Not exaggerating here. We're talking about explosions that make every bomb ever detonated by humans look like firecrackers at a birthday party. This kind of impact creates heat that can melt rock and ice within seconds. And here's the kicker. About 12,800 years ago, massive ice sheets covered large portions of North America, Europe, and Asia. Ice sheets that were in some places over 2 miles thick enough that if you were standing on top, you couldn't see the ground, even on a clear day. These weren't your neighborhood ice rink, or even your frozen Great Lakes situation. These were continental ice domes that contained enough water to raise global sea levels by hundreds of feet if they melted. So what happens when you drop multiple cosmic blowtorches onto ice sheets that size? Exactly what you'd expect if you've ever watched ice cubes melt in hot water, except scaled up to continental proportions and happening fast. The ice didn't just gradually melt over thousands of years like the standard ice age retreat. It catastrophically collapsed. We're talking about chunks of ice the size of small countries breaking off and melting, releasing quantities of fresh water into the oceans that would make every modern flood look like someone left the bathtub running. Geological evidence shows massive flooding events during this period, with water channels carved into bedrock that could only have been created by absolutely tremendous volumes of water moving at high speed. The kind of erosion patterns you see in these ancient flood channels suggest water flows that would dwarf the Amazon River at peak flood. We're talking thousands of times more water, moving faster than any river on Earth today, carving new landscapes, in days or weeks. But wait, there's more. Because apparently one global catastrophe wasn't enough for this particular cosmic event. When you dump that much fresh water into the oceans that quickly, you don't just get flooding, you completely disrupt ocean currents that regulate global climate. The thermohaline circulation, which is science speak for the giant conveyor belt of warm and cold water that keeps the planet's temperature stable, basically shut down. Cold, fresh water from melting ice sheets poured into the North Atlantic, stopping the Gulf Stream in its tracks. For modern reference, the Gulf Stream is why Europe doesn't freeze solid every winter, despite being at the same latitude as Canada. It's a massive current of warm water that acts like planetary central heating. Turn it off, and suddenly northern regions that were getting mild temperatures are dealing with Arctic conditions. This is what triggered the rapid cooling that defines the Younger Dryas period, creating what scientists politely call extremely unfavorable conditions for human civilization, and what any reasonable person would call everything freezing and dying. Now, if you thought melting ice sheets and climate disruption were bad enough, let's not forget about the immediate aftermath of the actual impacts. When space rocks hit Earth's surface or detonate in the atmosphere, they throw up massive amounts of debris, dust, ash, pulverized rock, and whatever else happens to be in the impact zone. This material gets launched into the upper atmosphere, where it spreads around the globe, blocking sunlight and creating what's essentially an impact winter. Think of it like nuclear winter, except instead of radioactive fallout from bombs, you've got natural fallout from cosmic bombardment. Crops fail because there's not enough sunlight for photosynthesis. Animals die because the plants die. The temperature drops even further because the sun's warmth can't reach the surface. Any humans who survived the initial impacts, the floods, and the tsunamis, now have to deal with the agricultural equivalent of trying to grow tomatoes in your basement with a flashlight. Not exactly ideal farming conditions. Speaking of tsunamis, let's address the elephant in the room. Or rather, the walls of water the size of skyscrapers in the ocean. When these cosmic fragments hit the ice sheets and oceans, they didn't just make a splash and call it a day. The impacts generated tsunamis that would make the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami look like a ripple in a pond. We're talking waves potentially hundreds of meters high. That's taller than most high-rise buildings. racing across oceans at the speed of a jet aircraft. Coastal civilizations, if they existed, would have had zero warning and zero chance. The water would have moved inland for miles, obliterating everything in its path and then dragging the debris back out to sea. Geological surveys have found evidence of massive marine sediment deposits far inland in locations around the world, sediments that could only have been placed there by truly catastrophic flooding events. The kind of flooding that picks up boulders the size of cars and drops them miles from where they started. Now here's where the story gets even more interesting, if that's possible. Some researchers propose that the impacts were severe enough to cause a shift in Earth's rotational axis. Not a complete flip, but enough of a wobble to alter climate patterns and possibly trigger increased seismic and volcanic activity. When you hit a spinning object hard enough from the side, it doesn't just absorb the impact, it changes how it spins. Earth is essentially a giant spinning top, and if you whack it with enough force, you're going to affect its rotation. A shift in the axis would explain why ancient maps and astronomical observations don't quite line up with modern geography and star positions. It would also explain why multiple ancient cultures report the sky changing, the stars moving, and the sun rising in different positions. Descriptions that sound like mythology but might be eyewitness accounts of genuine celestial changes. The seismic effects alone would have been nightmare fuel. Major impacts can trigger earthquakes along fault lines thousands of miles away, setting off a cascade of tectonic activity. Volcanoes that were dormant suddenly erupt. Earthquakes that normally happen every few centuries all decide to throw a party at the same time. The geological record shows evidence of increased volcanic activity during the Younger Dryas period, with volcanic ash layers appearing in ice cores and sediment deposits from this exact time frame. So not only are people dealing with fire from space, floods from melting ice, tsunamis from impacts, and climate collapse from atmospheric debris, now the ground itself is shaking and mountains are exploding. It's like Earth decided to throw every disaster at humanity simultaneously, just to see what would happen. Here's what really drives the point home about the scale of this catastrophe. Every major ancient civilization has flood myths. Every single one. Not most of them, or several important ones. Literally every significant ancient culture from Mesopotamia to China to the Americas has stories about a great deluge that destroyed the world and forced humanity to start over. The standard academic explanation for this has always been that ancient people lived near rivers. Rivers flood sometimes, therefore they made up similar stories independently. Which is a bit like saying that everyone happened to dream about the same oddly specific nightmare on the same night by pure coincidence. The more logical explanation is that they're all describing the same event, filtered through different cultural lenses and passed down through oral tradition for thousands of years before being written down. When the Mesopotamians describe Utnapishtim building a boat to survive the flood, when the Hebrew Bible describes Noah doing the same thing, when the Hindu texts describe Manu being warned by a fish deity about coming destruction, when Native American tribes describe world-ending floods, they're all pulling from the same catastrophic event that actually happened. The scientific evidence keeps piling up in ways that make the cosmic impact theory harder and harder to dismiss. Researchers have found a layer of what they call black mat across multiple sites in North America. A carbon-rich layer packed with the remains of burned biomass, dating to exactly the Younger Dryas boundary. This isn't evidence of normal forest fires or slow accumulation. This is evidence of massive, continent-wide burning happening in a short period. The kind of burning you'd expect if, say, superheated air from atmospheric detonations ignited vegetation across thousands of square miles simultaneously. They've also found nanodiamonds, carbon spherules, and magnetic microspherules in this layer, materials that form only under conditions of extreme heat and pressure, the kind you get from high-velocity impacts or massive explosions. But perhaps the most compelling evidence comes from studying the extinction patterns of megafauna during this period. The Younger Dryas marks one of the most dramatic die-offs of large animals in recent geological history. Mastodons, giant ground sloths, saber-toothed cats, dire wolves. These weren't struggling species slowly dying out over millennia. These were successful, thriving animals that suddenly disappeared from the fossil record in what amounts to an instant in evolutionary time. The extinction rate was so dramatic and so geographically widespread that it screams catastrophic event rather than gradual environmental change. Something killed off these animals fast, and that something wasn't just climate change in the modern understanding. It was climate catastrophe coupled with habitat destruction on a scale we can barely imagine. The human population crash during this period is even more striking when you look at the archaeological evidence, or rather, the sudden lack of it. Archaeological sites showing human activity drop off dramatically at the Younger Dryas boundary. Not gradually, not region by region, suddenly, across multiple continents. It's like someone hit the pause button on human civilization for over 1,000 years. When sites show up again in the archaeological record, they're often in different locations and show different cultural patterns, suggesting that surviving populations had to migrate, adapt, and essentially rebuild society from scratch. The genetic evidence backs this up too, showing what scientists call a population bottleneck, a dramatic reduction in human genetic diversity that dates to roughly this same period. We'll get into the DNA evidence more later, but the point is that the genetic data confirms what the archaeological record suggests. Something nearly wiped us out. Now you might be wondering why you haven't heard about this theory in every history class or science documentary. Good question. The cosmic impact hypothesis for the Younger Dryas has been controversial in academic circles, which is science speak for a lot of very smart people have spent their entire careers building theories that this new evidence contradicts, and they're not thrilled about it. There's been significant resistance to the impact theory from researchers who prefer explanations that don't require cosmic catastrophes. They'd rather attribute the Younger Dryas to gradual processes or regional events. But the evidence keeps accumulating, and more researchers are accepting that something extraordinary happened around 12,800 years ago that fits the impact scenario better than any alternative explanation. Science moves slowly, especially when it requires overturning long-held assumptions. But it does eventually move toward the evidence. The implications of this cosmic catastrophe theory go far beyond just explaining Noah's flood or ancient myths. If this event actually happened, and the evidence strongly suggests it did, then we're talking about a near-extinction event for humanity that occurred relatively recently in our species' history. We came within a hair's breadth of being wiped out completely. The survivors, whoever they were and wherever they managed to shelter, became the ancestors of every human alive today. They preserved knowledge, skills, and stories through one of the most devastating periods in human history, passing them down through generations until we could write them down and try to make sense of what our distant ancestors experienced. Those flood stories aren't just myths, they're survival stories, warning stories, testimonies from people who lived through hell and wanted their descendants to remember. So when we talk about Noah's flood being caused by divine judgment, maybe we should consider whether ancient people, lacking our scientific framework, described a cosmic catastrophe in the only terms that made sense to them, as an act of the gods. When the sky literally rained fire, when the ice mountains melted and drowned the world, when the very axis of the earth seemed to shift, how else would you explain that except as divine intervention? They weren't wrong about what happened. They just interpreted the cause through their cultural and religious understanding of how the universe worked. The event was real. The catastrophe was real. The near total destruction of human civilization was real. We're only now developing the scientific tools and frameworks to understand what actually caused it. But the ancient accounts were trying to tell us all along. Something fell from the heavens and nearly ended everything. And here's the truly unsettling part that should keep you up at night. Comets and asteroids are still out there. The cosmic shooting gallery that is our solar system hasn't shut down for business. We live on a planet that's constantly moving through space, occasionally crossing paths with debris fields and orbital paths of objects that could do exactly what happened 12,800 years ago. We've gotten better at detecting these threats, sure. NASA and other space agencies track near-Earth objects and calculate impact probabilities. But there are still objects we haven't detected, trajectories we haven't calculated, and frankly, limited options if we did spot something big heading our way. The dinosaurs didn't have a space program, and look how that worked out for them. We do have a space program, but whether we could actually deflect or destroy a major impactor remains a very open question. The ancients couldn't predict or prevent their cosmic catastrophe. We might be slightly better equipped, but slightly better isn't particularly comforting when you're talking about civilization-ending events. This is why the story of Noah's flood matters beyond religious or historical interest. It's a reminder that Earth is not a safe, stable platform where we can just keep building civilization without worrying about external threats. The cosmic catastrophe that triggered the Younger Dryas and the flood events that followed wasn't a one-time deal. It was one event in a long history of impacts and near misses that will continue into the future. Understanding what happened then isn't just about solving an ancient mystery. It's about recognizing that our ancestors survived something we might have to face again. Their stories, their myths, their warnings about world-ending floods and fire from heaven, these aren't primitive superstitions. They're disaster documentation from survivors trying to warn us across thousands of years that the universe is dangerous, Earth has been hit before, and we'd better pay attention because it will happen again. So we've established that something absolutely catastrophic happened around 12,800 years ago that nearly ended life as we know it. But here's where things get even more interesting. Because we can actually prove that humanity nearly went extinct using the one thing that doesn't lie, doesn't forget, and keeps receipts like an obsessive accountant: your DNA. That's right. The genetic code sitting in every cell of your body is basically a historical record of everything your ancestors went through, including that time roughly 12,000 years ago when humanity got reduced to what scientists politely call a population bottleneck, and what any reasonable person would call, we almost didn't make it, folks. Welcome to the chapter where molecular biology crashes into ancient mythology and confirms that, yeah, we really did almost get wiped out. Let's start with what a population bottleneck actually means, because it sounds like some kind of traffic jam, but it's way more dramatic than that. Imagine humanity as this sprawling, genetically diverse species spread across multiple continents with thousands of different family lineages, each carrying unique genetic markers passed down through countless generations. Now, imagine something happens that kills off the vast majority of these lineages, leaving only a handful of survivors. So few that when geneticists look back at human DNA today, they can see that we all, every single one of us, descend from this tiny group of people who made it through whatever hell happened. It's like the entire human family tree got pruned down to just a few branches, and everything growing today sprouted from those survivors. Not exactly the diverse gene pool you'd want if you're trying to rebuild a species, but it's what we got, and somehow it worked. The evidence for this bottleneck is written into our DNA in ways that are frankly impossible to argue with unless you're committed to ignoring science entirely. When geneticists analyze human populations from around the world, and I mean genuinely diverse populations from Africa, Asia, Europe, the Americas, everywhere, they find something shocking. Despite humans living on different continents for tens of thousands of years, developing different cultures, languages, and physical adaptations to different climates, we have remarkably little genetic diversity compared to what you'd expect. In fact, we have less genetic diversity than chimpanzees, who live in a much smaller geographic area. Think about that for a second. Chimps, who all hang out in equatorial Africa and number maybe a few 100,000, have more genetic variety than 7 billion humans spread across the entire planet. That's not normal. That's not what you'd see if human populations had been steadily growing and diversifying for hundreds of thousands of years without interruption. That's what you see when something killed off most of humanity and forced everyone alive today to descend from a very small survivor pool. The timing of this bottleneck is what makes it absolutely relevant to our flood discussion. Multiple genetic studies, using different methods and analyzing different populations, consistently point to a major reduction in human genetic diversity occurring between 10,000 and 15,000 years ago, with the most dramatic change happening right around 12,000 years ago. Now, if you've been paying attention, you'll notice that's the exact same time frame as the Younger Dryas event we discussed in the previous chapter. The cosmic catastrophe that dropped space rocks on Earth, melted ice sheets, triggered global flooding, and generally made life extremely difficult for anyone trying to survive. This is not a coincidence. The genetic evidence and the geological evidence are telling the same story from different angles, like two witnesses to the same disaster, describing what they saw. The rocks and ice cores tell us something catastrophic happened. The DNA tells us humanity almost died out at the exact same time. Put those two things together, and you have a pretty compelling case that these events are connected. Now let's talk about how scientists actually figured this out, because the methodology is pretty fascinating even if it sounds technical. Geneticists look at two main types of DNA to trace human lineages: mitochondrial DNA, which you inherit only from your mother, and Y chromosome DNA, which males inherit only from their fathers. These bits of genetic code get passed down through generations, with small mutations accumulating over time, kind of like a genetic clock that ticks forward with each generation. By comparing the mitochondrial DNA and Y chromosomes of people from all over the world, scientists can trace back how long ago all of us shared common ancestors. It's like doing ancestry research, except instead of looking at documents and family trees, You're reading the actual genetic text that's been copied and passed down through your family line for thousands of years. And what these studies consistently show is that all living humans can trace their maternal lineage back to a relatively small group of women who lived around 10,000 to 15,000 years ago. And all males can trace their paternal lineage back to an equally small group of men from the same period. This doesn't mean there was literally one woman and one man who survived. That's a misinterpretation that gets thrown around sometimes and drives geneticists absolutely crazy. What it means is that the number of reproducing individuals dropped dramatically during this period, and only certain lineages survived to pass on their genes to future generations. Think of it like a massive tournament where thousands of players enter, but only a handful make it to the finals. And everyone watching today is descended from those finalists. The other lineages didn't necessarily die out immediately. Some probably survived for a generation or two after the catastrophe, but they eventually disappeared either through simple bad luck, inability to find mates in a drastically reduced population, or death from the ongoing effects of the environmental collapse. The point is, by the time things stabilized and humanity started recovering and expanding again, the genetic diversity that had existed before was largely gone, replaced by the much more limited genetic palette of the survivor group. Here's where it gets really interesting from a biblical perspective, even if you're not religious. The Genesis account describes Noah and his 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, as the patriarchs of all humanity after the flood, with their wives being the only surviving women. That's 8 people total, which would create an extreme bottleneck if taken literally. The genetic evidence suggests the actual number was larger, probably a few thousand individuals scattered across different regions, but the basic pattern matches. A catastrophic event reduces humanity to a small survivor population. These survivors become the ancestors of everyone who comes after, and the genetic record shows reduced diversity as a result. Ancient texts from multiple cultures echo this same pattern. Small groups of survivors preserved through divine intervention or luck, becoming the founders of the new world. The Sumerian king list describes how, after the flood, kingship descended again from the survivors. Hindu texts describe Manu being saved with 7 sages and their families. Greek mythology talks about Deucalion and Pyrrha repopulating the world after Zeus flooded it. These aren't identical stories. The details vary based on the culture telling them. But the core narrative of a catastrophic flood followed by humanity rebuilding from a tiny survivor population is remarkably consistent across disconnected civilizations. Now, you might be wondering how scientists know this bottleneck happened globally rather than being a series of regional events that just happened to reduce different populations at different times. Great question, and the answer is in the synchronization of the genetic signatures. When you analyze populations from different continents, Indigenous Americans, Australian Aboriginals, African populations, Europeans, East Asians, they all show signs of this bottleneck happening at roughly the same time. Not spread out over thousands of years, not staggered by region, but synchronized to within a fairly narrow time frame that corresponds to the Younger Dryas period. If the reduction in genetic diversity was caused by local disasters or gradual environmental changes affecting different regions at different times, you'd expect to see different timings in different populations. But that's not what the data shows. The data shows a global event that affected human populations worldwide more or less simultaneously, which is exactly what you'd expect from a planetary-scale catastrophe like the one we discussed in the previous chapter. The genetic evidence also reveals something else that's kind of unsettling when you think about it. Before this bottleneck, there were other human species coexisting with modern humans, Neanderthals in Europe and Asia, Denisovans in Asia, possibly other groups we haven't even identified yet. After the bottleneck, they're gone. Extinct. Done. Only modern humans survived in sufficient numbers to rebuild. Now, standard evolutionary theory suggests these species were already declining and would have gone extinct anyway due to competition with modern humans or climate change. But the timing is suspicious. All of these human species go extinct right around the same period when modern human genetic diversity crashes. It suggests that whatever catastrophe hammered modern humans hit these other species even harder, possibly wiping them out entirely, because they had smaller populations or less favorable geographic distributions when the disaster struck. We carry tiny amounts of Neanderthal and Denisovan DNA because there was some interbreeding before they disappeared. But these species as independent populations didn't make it through the bottleneck. We did, barely, and we're the only human species left standing. Let's talk about what surviving this bottleneck actually meant for the people who lived through it. because the genetic evidence can tell us something about that too. When a population goes through a severe bottleneck, harmful genetic mutations that would normally be diluted in a large, diverse population become more common because there are fewer genetic variants to mask them. It's called inbreeding depression in biology, and it's the reason why isolated populations that don't have genetic exchange with outside groups tend to accumulate genetic problems. The human population after the flood bottleneck would have faced exactly this issue: a limited gene pool, probably some degree of inbreeding out of necessity given the small number of survivors, and all the genetic consequences that come with that. We can see evidence of this in the human genome today. Certain genetic disorders appear in all human populations at rates that suggest they became fixed in the gene pool after a bottleneck event. These aren't disorders that provide any evolutionary advantage. They're just genetic baggage that got locked in when the population crashed and never got selected out because they're not severe enough to prevent reproduction. It's like humanity's genetic scar tissue from nearly going extinct. The archaeological record backs up what the genetics are telling us in ways that should make anyone pay attention. Human settlement patterns show a dramatic change around 12,000 years ago. Before this period, you see evidence of human activity spread across various regions, with multiple distinct cultural groups doing their own thing. After this period, there's a gap in the archaeological record. Fewer sites, less evidence of human activity. And when settlements start appearing again, they're often in different locations and show different cultural characteristics than what came before. It's like someone hit the reset button on human civilization. The survivors had to start over, building new communities and new locations, developing new technologies and cultural practices, because the old ones either didn't survive or needed to be adapted to radically changed environmental conditions. The genetic bottleneck isn't just visible in DNA. It's visible in the physical remains of human activity, or rather, the sudden lack thereof during this critical period. One of the most striking pieces of genetic evidence comes from studying genetic diversity within different human populations, compared to between them. When you look at the genetic differences between, say, an indigenous Australian and a Northern European, the differences are actually pretty minimal considering these populations were separated for tens of thousands of years and adapted to, radically, different environments. In most species, you'd expect far more genetic divergence between populations that have been isolated for that long. But in humans, the genetic differences between distant populations are fairly modest, and crucially, almost all human genetic diversity exists within individual populations rather than between them. What this tells us is that the divergence we see today, the physical differences in skin color, body shape, facial features that we associate with different geographic populations, mostly happened after the bottleneck, during the relatively recent expansion of humanity over the past 10,000 years or so. Before the bottleneck, there was probably more genetic diversity between different human populations. After the bottleneck, everyone's descended from a much more genetically similar founder group, and the variations we see today are mostly surface-level adaptations that evolved quickly in response to local environments. Now here's where things get into slightly more controversial territory, but it's worth discussing because it comes up in ancient texts, and modern genetic research is trying to figure it out. Some ancient accounts, particularly the Book of Enoch and certain interpretations of Genesis, describe genetic abnormalities or unusual characteristics in pre-flood populations. The Nephilim, described as giants or people with unusual physical traits, supposedly the offspring of sons of God and human women. Mainstream genetics doesn't support the existence of a race of actual giants or human divine hybrids, obviously, because that's getting into supernatural territory that science can't address. But what genetics can tell us is that ancient human populations did have more genetic variation than modern humans, including variants that we don't see today because they didn't survive the bottleneck. Some ancient skeletal remains show characteristics that are rare or absent in modern populations: unusual height, distinctive skull shapes, skeletal structures that don't quite match modern human norms. These could be natural variations that existed in pre-bottleneck populations and got lost when those lineages died out. Or, if you want to get really speculative, they could be evidence of isolated populations that had diverged genetically from mainstream humanity and either didn't survive the catastrophe or didn't survive the aftermath. The genetic record can't prove or disprove ancient myths about Nephilim, but it can confirm that there was more human genetic diversity before the bottleneck than after, and some of that diversity was quite different from what we see today. The implications of this genetic evidence go beyond just confirming that a catastrophe happened. It tells us something profound about human resilience and adaptability. We came within a hair's breadth of extinction, reduced to possibly just a few thousand individuals, scattered survivors trying to rebuild in a world that had been devastated by cosmic impacts, climate collapse, and environmental chaos. And yet here we are today, 7 billion strong, having spread to every corner of the planet and built civilizations that would be utterly incomprehensible to those survivors. Every human alive today carries in their DNA the legacy of that near-extinction event and the testimony of those survivors who made it through. We're all descended from people who survived the unsurvivable, who rebuilt civilization from ashes and ice, who passed down stories and knowledge through generations so that we could eventually understand what happened to our species during its darkest hour. The genetic bottleneck isn't just an interesting scientific finding. It's proof that we almost didn't make it, and everything that came after, all of human history and achievement, exists because a small group of our ancestors refused to give up when the world ended around them. And perhaps most importantly, this genetic evidence gives us a way to test the flood narrative using hard science, rather than just faith or mythology. You can dismiss ancient texts as stories or legends if you want. Many people do. But you can't dismiss DNA. The genetic code doesn't care about your beliefs or biases. It records what actually happened to populations over time with mathematical precision. And what it records, consistently across multiple studies using different methods, is that human genetic diversity crashed around 12,000 years ago, in a pattern consistent with a global catastrophe that reduced humanity to a small survivor population. This doesn't prove every detail of the Noah's Ark story is historically accurate. The genetic data can't tell us whether the survivors built a boat or hid in caves or got really lucky with geography. But it does prove that the core claim, that humanity went through a population bottleneck following a global catastrophe, and that we're all descended from the survivors of that event, is not just mythology. It's encoded in the genome of every person reading this, a molecular record of the time humanity almost ended and somehow pulled through. That's not Sunday school fiction. That's biology, history, and survival, all wrapped up in the double helix that makes you who you are. So we've established that humanity nearly got wiped out around 12,000 years ago, with only a handful of survivors making it through to rebuild civilization from scratch. But here's the uncomfortable question that mainstream archaeology really doesn't want to address. What if the people who almost got wiped out weren't primitive hunter-gatherers barely scratching out a living with stone tools? What if they were actually way more advanced than we've been told, possessing technologies and knowledge that got lost in the catastrophe and took millennia to rediscover? If we've even rediscovered all of it yet. Welcome to the chapter where we examine the archaeological evidence that suggests our ancestors before the flood might have been doing things that make modern engineers scratch their heads and wonder how the heck they pulled it off without power. Tools, computers, or even the wheel in some cases. Let's start with Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, because this site alone is enough to overturn pretty much everything you learned in school about ancient history. Discovered in the 1990s and continuously excavated since then, Göbekli Tepe is a massive complex of carved stone pillars arranged in circles, some weighing up to 20 tons, decorated with intricate carvings of animals and abstract symbols. The kicker? It's been dated to around 11,600 years ago, right after the Younger Dryas period ended. According to mainstream historical timelines, the people who built this should have been small bands of hunter-gatherers who hadn't even figured out agriculture yet. They shouldn't have had the organization, the manpower, or the technical knowledge to quarry, transport, and erect multi-ton stone pillars, let alone carve them with sophisticated imagery. But there it is, sitting in the Turkish countryside, basically saying, everything you think you know about human development is wrong. The site shows evidence of advanced astronomical knowledge encoded into its layout, sophisticated understanding of geometry and organizational capacity that supposedly didn't exist for another few thousand years. It's like finding a Ferrari in a cave painting. It shouldn't be there, but it is, and it demands explanation. Then you've got Puma Punku in Bolivia, which is essentially the universe's way of trolling modern archaeologists. This site features stone blocks cut with such precision that they fit together without mortar. We're talking tolerances of less than a millimeter between surfaces, perfectly flat planes extending across meters of stone, and complex interlocking shapes that would be challenging to produce even with modern CNC machines. The stones themselves are made of andesite and diorite, which are extremely hard rocks that rank pretty high on the Mohs hardness scale. Try carving those with copper chisels, which is what mainstream archaeology claims these people had access to, and you'll quickly realize it doesn't work. Copper is softer than the stone, so you'd just be scratching at it ineffectively, probably while crying in frustration. Yet somehow the builders of Pumapunku achieved surface finishes and geometric precision that would make a modern stonemason jealous. They created perfectly straight edges, exact right angles, and complex three-dimensional cuts that interlock like massive stone LEGO blocks. And they did this at an elevation of over 12,000 feet in the Andes Mountains, which raises additional questions about how they transported blocks weighing multiple tons up mountainsides with supposedly primitive technology. The conventional explanation for these sites goes something like, well, they had a lot of time and a lot of workers, so eventually they figured it out through trial and error. Which is basically academic speak for, we have no idea how they did this. But we're not allowed to say that out loud. It's the archaeological equivalent of shrugging and hoping nobody asks follow-up questions. But here's the thing. Precision stone cutting isn't something you figure out through trial and error when you're working with multi-ton blocks. You can't just say, oops, messed that one up, when you're carving a 15-ton stone pillar and start over. The material cost, the labor investment, and the technical challenges mean you need to know exactly what you're doing before you start. This implies advanced planning, mathematical knowledge, sophisticated measuring tools, and probably construction techniques that we don't fully understand because the knowledge got lost when civilization got reset by the flood. Let's talk about the Great Pyramid of Giza, because even though it's been studied to death, it still contains mysteries that make engineers uncomfortable. The standard narrative is that it was built around 4,500 years ago by Egyptian pharaohs using copper tools, wooden sledges, and lots of manual labor. But when you actually look at the precision involved, things get weird. The base of the pyramid is level to within less than an inch across its 756-foot length. The sides are aligned to the cardinal directions, with accuracy better than most modern buildings. The internal passages are cut through solid limestone, with walls that are perfectly flat and parallel. Some of the granite blocks used in the internal chambers weigh up to 80 tons and were somehow transported from quarries hundreds of miles away, then lifted and positioned with such precision that you can't fit a razor blade between the joints. Now, could this have been accomplished with Bronze Age technology? Maybe, if you throw enough time, manpower, and clever engineering at the problem. But what's interesting is that the technical sophistication of Egyptian stonework seems to decline over time rather than improve. The earliest dynasties produced the most impressive constructions, with later dynasties building progressively less sophisticated structures. That's backwards from how technological development normally works. You expect early attempts to be crude and later ones to be refined. Unless, of course, the earliest dynasties were working with inherited knowledge from before the flood that they didn't fully understand and gradually forgot. Now let's address the elephant in the room, or rather, the massive stone blocks scattered across multiple continents. How did pre-flood people supposedly cut, transport, and position these things without modern equipment? There are several theories floating around, ranging from they used basic tools very cleverly to they had advanced technology that got lost. The mainstream explanation involves copper tools, sand abrasives, wooden rollers, and massive amounts of human labor, which might work for smaller blocks and simpler cuts, but struggles to explain the most impressive examples of ancient megalithic construction. Alternative researchers propose everything from sonic levitation to ancient power tools to geopolymer cement that let them mold stones rather than cut them. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle. Not ancient aliens with anti-gravity devices, but also not cavemen with copper chisels. More likely, pre-flood civilizations had developed sophisticated but non-electrical technologies that we've lost, and are only now beginning to rediscover through experimental archaeology. Mechanical advantage, chemical processes, clever use of materials and geometry. There are lots of ways to accomplish impressive engineering without needing electricity or computers. The astronomical knowledge encoded in these ancient sites is particularly fascinating and suggests a level of scientific sophistication that supposedly didn't exist yet. Göbekli Tepe's pillars align with stars and constellations in ways that indicate the builders were tracking celestial cycles. The Great Pyramid aligns with true north with remarkable accuracy, and its dimensions encode mathematical relationships, including pi and phi. Stonehenge functions as an astronomical calendar, tracking solstices and lunar cycles. Sites across the world show similar patterns, ancient builders who were obsessed with the heavens and incorporated astronomical knowledge into their monuments. Why would supposedly primitive people care so much about tracking stars and planetary movements? The conventional answer is religious worship. They thought the sky gods needed monitoring. But another possibility is that they inherited knowledge from an earlier civilization that understood astronomy was important for predicting seasonal cycles, navigational purposes, or potentially tracking cosmic threats like comet swarms that had nearly destroyed their ancestors during the Younger Dryas catastrophe. Ancient people weren't stupid. If they spent enormous effort tracking and recording astronomical events, they probably had good practical reasons beyond just pleasing the gods. This brings us to a rather provocative question that makes academics squirm. Was Noah's Ark actually just a wooden boat? Or could it have been something more sophisticated? The biblical account describes specific dimensions and construction techniques, but it's worth remembering that the Genesis narrative was written down centuries or millennia after the events, based on oral traditions that had been filtered through multiple languages and cultures. Earlier flood accounts from Sumerian and Akkadian sources describe the survival vessel differently, sometimes as a boat, sometimes as a structure or shelter, sometimes with dimensions that don't quite match the biblical version. What if the original ark was actually an underground shelter or high-altitude refuge, a technologically sophisticated survival chamber that got translated into the simpler metaphor of a boat as the story was retold through generations? The core message remains the same. Advanced knowledge allowed certain people to survive the catastrophe by building appropriate shelter, but the actual form of that shelter might have been misunderstood or simplified in the retelling. After all, if you're trying to explain a complex technological installation to people who live in tents and don't have the vocabulary for advanced engineering, you might describe it using the closest familiar concept, which in a maritime culture would be a large boat. Consider what surviving a global catastrophe would actually require if you knew it was coming and had the technological capability to prepare. You'd need protection from the immediate impacts, whether that's cosmic fragments hitting the atmosphere, tsunamis, earthquakes, or extreme temperature fluctuations. You'd need supplies to outlast the aftermath: food, water, seeds, tools, and, crucially, knowledge preservation. You'd want to save not just people, but also animals, plants, and the cumulative technological and scientific knowledge of your civilization. A simple wooden boat, no matter how large, isn't really adequate for all of that. But a sophisticated shelter system, possibly underground, possibly at high elevation, possibly with multiple connected chambers for different purposes, starts to make more sense. The Genesis account mentions Noah taking 7 pairs of clean animals and pairs of unclean animals, which, if taken literally, would require a vessel far larger than the described dimensions could accommodate. But if it's a metaphor for preserving genetic diversity through selective breeding populations, or even early forms of genetic preservation, the story starts to work better. The 40 days and 40 nights becomes not a literal timetable, but an acknowledgement that the catastrophe lasted long enough that you needed serious preparation to survive it. The geographical distribution of these advanced megalithic sites is also telling. They're found on every inhabited continent, from the Americas to Africa, to Asia, to Europe, and the Pacific Islands. The standard explanation is that different cultures independently developed similar building techniques, which is possible, but requires quite a bit of coincidence. Alternative researchers suggest these sites are remnants of a global civilization that existed before the flood, one that had developed advanced construction techniques and astronomical knowledge that got passed down to post-flood cultures in varying degrees of completeness. The flood didn't destroy all knowledge simultaneously everywhere. Some groups survived with more intact knowledge than others. Some sites survived the flooding better than others, and the rebuilding process happened at different rates in different regions. This would explain why you see impressive megalithic construction happening relatively early after the Younger Dryas period. It's not that people suddenly figured out advanced building techniques. It's that survivors with existing knowledge began rebuilding as soon as conditions allowed. Let's talk about the mathematics encoded in these ancient structures, because this is where things get properly weird. The Great Pyramid incorporates the value of pi in its dimensions, the ratio of its perimeter to its height. This is mathematically elegant, but also raises questions because pi supposedly wasn't formally defined until Greek mathematicians worked it out thousands of years later. Multiple ancient sites incorporate the golden ratio, a mathematical constant that appears throughout nature and optimal design. Göbekli Tepe's layout incorporates geometric relationships that suggest knowledge of advanced mathematics. Now, you could argue these are coincidences, Maybe ancient builders stumbled onto these ratios through trial and error or aesthetic sense, without understanding the underlying mathematics. But when you see the same mathematical relationships showing up in structures built by different cultures in different time periods across different continents, coincidence starts wearing thin. The more parsimonious explanation is that mathematical knowledge survived from pre-flood civilization and got incorporated into post-flood construction, even if the builders didn't always fully understand why these ratios were significant. They just knew from inherited tradition that this is how you do it. The precision measurement capabilities implied by these structures deserve particular attention. To cut stone blocks that fit together with tolerances measured in fractions of a millimeter, you need precision measuring tools. To align structures with cardinal directions to fractions of a degree, you need accurate surveying equipment. To encode specific mathematical ratios in construction, you need the ability to measure and calculate those ratios. Modern engineers use laser levels, digital theodolites, precision calipers, and computer-aided design. Ancient builders supposedly used string, wooden poles, and eyeballing it. There's a disconnect here. Some researchers propose that ancient civilizations had developed sophisticated non-electrical measuring tools, precision straightedges, optical alignment devices, mechanical calculators, that we haven't found because they weren't preserved in the archaeological record. Wood and fiber decay, copper gets recycled, and after a civilization-ending catastrophe, the survivors might have more immediate concerns than preserving surveying equipment. What survives are the stone structures that demonstrate the precision was achieved, even if the tools used to achieve it are lost to time. The construction logistics alone suggest advanced organizational capabilities that supposedly didn't exist. Building something like the Great Pyramid or Göbekli Tepe requires coordinating thousands of workers, managing supply chains for food and materials, organizing specialized labor for different tasks, and maintaining this effort over extended periods. This is project management on a scale that requires administrative systems, probably written records, possibly mathematical accounting methods, and definitely sophisticated social organization. The conventional timeline says these capabilities developed gradually as agriculture allowed settled communities, which enabled specialization, which led to complex societies. But what if it happened the other way around? What if complex organizational capabilities existed before the flood, got disrupted by the catastrophe, and then slowly recovered as survivors rebuilt? The earliest post-flood structures show the most sophistication, suggesting inherited knowledge rather than gradual development. It's only later, as the knowledge degraded and societies forgot the old techniques, that construction became progressively less impressive. Here's where we need to address what got lost. Imagine you're part of a technologically advanced civilization that gets hit by a cosmic catastrophe. The immediate survivors are probably not the scientists, engineers, and knowledge keepers. They were likely living in cities and centers of learning that got destroyed first. The survivors are more likely to be rural populations, people in remote areas, or those who got lucky with geography. They probably understand how to use the technology of their civilization, but not necessarily how to build it or maintain it. Think about modern society. Most people can use a smartphone, but very few could build one from scratch or even explain in detail how it works. If civilization collapsed tomorrow, the survivors might know that complex technology existed, but lack the specific knowledge to recreate it. They'd pass down stories about the advanced capabilities of their ancestors, but with each generation, the details get hazier and the stories become more mythological. Eventually, you get people building crude copies of ancient structures, unable to match the precision of the originals because the knowledge of how to achieve it has been lost. That's what we might be seeing in the archaeological record. A gradual decline from inherited sophistication to locally redeveloped techniques that don't quite match what came before. The underwater sites we'll discuss in the next chapter provide additional evidence for pre-flood technological advancement, but it's worth noting here that if advanced structures existed in coastal areas before the sea level rise, most of them would now be underwater and largely unexplored. We've barely scratched the surface of deepwater archaeology, pun absolutely intended. The structures we have found on land, the pyramids, megaliths, and ancient monuments, might just be the inland remnants of a civilization whose major centers were coastal and are now submerged. This would explain why the land-based sites seem to appear suddenly in the archaeological record with impressive sophistication. They're not the beginning of technological development, but the survivors of a flood that destroyed the more advanced coastal infrastructure. Imagine if modern civilization got hit by a similar catastrophe tomorrow. 1,000 years later, archaeologists might find impressive remnants in mountain regions and inland areas, while the remains of our major coastal cities lie under hundreds of feet of water, unexplored and unrecognized. They might conclude that our civilization suddenly appeared with moderate technological capability, not realizing that the really advanced stuff is underwater where they haven't looked yet. So what's the takeaway from all this? The archaeological evidence strongly suggests that pre-flood human civilization was more advanced than we've been taught. Not ancient aliens advanced with flying saucers and laser weapons, but definitely beyond the primitive cavemen with stone tools narrative that dominated archaeology for most of the 20th century. They had sophisticated mathematical knowledge, astronomical understanding, precision engineering capabilities, and organizational systems that allowed them to build structures we struggle to explain even with modern technology. Much of this knowledge was lost in the catastrophe. The Younger Dryas impact, the flooding, the climate collapse, and had to be painstakingly rebuilt by survivors working with fragments of inherited wisdom. The great monuments and structures we see scattered across the world aren't crude first attempts by primitive people figuring things out from scratch. They're the remnants and reconstructions of a technological legacy that nearly got wiped out completely, preserved by survivors who understood that this knowledge was too valuable to lose, even if they didn't fully understand all of it anymore. And maybe, just maybe, hidden in the dimensions and layouts of these ancient structures are warnings and information encoded by people who survived one catastrophe and wanted to make sure their descendants would be prepared if it happened again. Because as we'll discuss later, there's uncomfortably strong evidence that these catastrophes are cyclical, which means our ancestors weren't just building monuments to impress the gods, they were building messages to warn us. All right, we've talked about cosmic catastrophes, genetic bottlenecks, and lost technologies. Now it's time to dive into the really controversial stuff that makes academics nervous and ancient astronaut theorists absolutely giddy. The question of who or what the ancient Sumerians were actually talking about when they described beings called the Anunnaki, who supposedly created humanity, got fed up with their creation and decided to hit the reset button with a global flood. Were these just mythological deities that ancient people invented to explain natural phenomena? Or could there be something more to these stories? Buckle up, because we're about to explore ancient texts that describe the flood in ways that are eerily specific, disturbingly detailed, and uncomfortably similar across cultures that supposedly never talked to each other. Let's start with the Sumerians, because these folks were basically the original record keepers of civilization. Around 5,000 years ago, they developed cuneiform writing and started documenting everything: administrative records, business transactions, poetry, mythology, and, crucially, their accounts of where humanity came from and what happened during the Great Catastrophe. The Epic of Atrahasis, written on clay tablets that have survived millennia, tells a story that should sound familiar but with some wild differences from the biblical version. According to this text, beings called the Anunnaki came to Earth and needed workers to mine precious materials, probably gold, though the texts aren't always crystal clear on the details. Mining is apparently hard work even for advanced beings, because the Anunnaki working in the mines started complaining, which in ancient Mesopotamia apparently led to the mother of all labor disputes. Their solution? Create a worker species by mixing their essence with existing primitive humans. Basically, the ultimate staffing solution. If you can't find good help, genetically engineer it yourself. Now, before you roll your eyes and dismiss this as pure mythology, let's talk about what the text actually describes. The Atrahasis doesn't just say, "the gods made people," in vague poetic terms. It describes a specific process involving the mixing of divine essence with clay, which could be metaphorical language for genetic material and biological matter, and the involvement of a goddess called Nintu, who acts as the overseer of this creation process. The text describes multiple attempts to get the formula right, with early failures producing beings with defects before they finally achieve the desired result. This sounds less like God waved his hand and humans appeared, and more like a description of genetic experimentation with trial and error, filtered through the vocabulary and understanding of ancient scribes trying to explain something they didn't fully comprehend. It's like trying to explain genetic engineering to someone from the Bronze Age. You'd probably end up using metaphors about mixing essences and divine intervention, because what else could you say that they'd understand? The Epic of Gilgamesh, possibly the oldest written story that has survived to the present, contains a flood narrative that predates the biblical account by at least 1,000 years, and possibly much more. In this version, a character named Utnapishtim describes how the gods decided to destroy humanity with a flood, but one god named Ea, also called Enki in other texts, decided to save one righteous man by warning him in advance. The warning comes through rather creative means. Ea speaks to a reed wall of Utnapishtim's house, which is either divine subterfuge to avoid directly violating the other god's decision, or possibly some kind of communication device that the ancient writer described as speaking reeds because that was the closest analogy available. Ea gives Utnapishtim specific instructions for building a vessel: dimensions, construction materials, waterproofing techniques, the whole works. This isn't build a boat as vague divine guidance. This is a detailed engineering specification, which raises the question of why a god would need to provide such specific technical details unless there were actual engineering principles involved that needed to be followed correctly for the plan to work. The parallels between these ancient Mesopotamian accounts and the biblical Noah story are impossible to ignore. In both narratives, humanity angers divine beings. A catastrophic flood is planned to destroy everyone. One righteous man gets advanced warning. He's given specific instructions to build a survival vessel. He brings his family and animals aboard. The flood destroys everything, and afterward the survivor makes a sacrifice that pleases the divine beings who then promise not to do it again. The details differ. The Sumerian version is more explicit about divine politics and infighting, while the biblical version frames it as monotheistic judgment and redemption. But the core story is identical. This is either the most impressive case of parallel mythological development in human history, or these are different cultural versions of the same actual event, with each culture adapting the story to fit their theological framework. Given that the Sumerian version is older and more detailed in certain technical aspects, it's at least plausible that the Hebrew scribes who compiled Genesis were working from earlier Mesopotamian sources and adapting them to their monotheistic tradition. Now let's address the Anunnaki themselves, because this is where things get properly speculative. In Sumerian texts, the Anunnaki are described as beings who came from the heavens, possessed advanced knowledge and capabilities, lived for extremely long periods, and had a hierarchical society with different ranks and responsibilities. They're not described as omnipotent or omniscient gods in the abstract sense. They argue with each other, make mistakes, have needs and desires, form factions, and operate under constraints. They sound less like supernatural deities and more like an advanced civilization with superior technology that ancient humans interpreted as divine. Because what else would you call beings who could do things you couldn't explain? If someone showed up in ancient Sumer with, say, aircraft, advanced medicine, or even just really good metallurgy and organizational skills, they'd probably get the god label pretty quickly. Not because they were actually supernatural, but because the gap between their capabilities and local technology was so vast that divine origin seemed like the only reasonable explanation. The ancient astronaut hypothesis takes this interpretation and runs with it, proposing that the Anunnaki were extraterrestrial visitors who came to Earth, genetically modified early humans to create workers, and eventually left or died out but not, before having a significant impact on human development. Now, I'm not here to tell you that ancient aliens definitely visited Earth and built the pyramids while wearing tinfoil hats. But I am saying that if you read these ancient texts without the assumption that everything must be either literal divine truth or pure mythology, you start to notice descriptions that sound like they could be attempts to explain advanced technology in pre-scientific language. Flying vehicles described as divine chariots. Communication devices described as speaking walls or divine voices. Genetic engineering described as mixing divine essence with clay. Powerful weapons described as divine thunder and fire from heaven. Either ancient people had incredibly vivid imaginations that consistently invented similar technological concepts across different cultures, or they were describing real technologies they'd witnessed but couldn't properly explain. The Book of Enoch, which didn't make it into the standard biblical canon but was considered scripture by some early Christian communities and is still canonical in Ethiopian Christianity, provides even more controversial details about pre-flood genetic manipulation. The text describes a group called the Watchers, divine beings who were supposed to observe humanity, but instead decided to get directly involved, which apparently violated their job description pretty severely. These Watchers descended to Earth, found human women attractive, because apparently cosmic beings have the same taste in partners as college students, and decided to have children with them. The resulting offspring were called Nephilim, described as giants and mighty men of renown who caused all sorts of problems. The text explicitly frames this genetic mixing as one of the primary reasons for the flood. The divine realm wanted to eliminate these hybrid beings and restore genetic purity to humanity. Whether you interpret this as literal genetic experimentation or as metaphor for cultural corruption, the consistent theme is that something about pre-flood humanity had become corrupted or contaminated to the point where a complete reset was deemed necessary. The Genesis account mentions the Nephilim too, though much more briefly and cryptically. Genesis 6 describes how the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful and took them as wives, and their children were the Nephilim, the mighty men who were of old, men of renown. The text then immediately transitions to God, observing that humanity had become corrupt and deciding to send the flood. The connection is implied but not explicitly stated. The appearance of these hybrid beings coincides with the decision to destroy humanity and start over. Traditional religious interpretation usually glosses over this passage or interprets it metaphorically as righteous bloodlines mixing with unrighteous ones. But the text, particularly when read alongside more detailed accounts like Enoch, seems to be describing something more specific: actual genetic mixing between two different types of beings producing offspring that weren't supposed to exist. Now, let's get scientific for a moment, because there's actually some interesting genetic evidence that could relate to this narrative, even if not in the way ancient astronaut theorists might hope. Modern humans carry DNA from Neanderthals and Denisovans, species we interbred with before they went extinct. These weren't sons of God scenarios, just different human species mixing genes. But here's what's interesting. This interbreeding happened before the population bottleneck we discussed earlier, and the genetic contribution from these other human species is relatively small and unevenly distributed across modern populations. After the bottleneck, the surviving human population was genetically more homogeneous, with only traces of these earlier admixtures remaining. If you were an ancient person trying to explain genetic diversity and then sudden homogeneity, you might describe it as different types of beings mixing, creating problems, and then a catastrophe eliminating most variants except for one pure lineage that survived to repopulate. The science doesn't support literal divine human hybrids, but it does support a pattern of genetic mixing, followed by a severe reduction that eliminated most variants, which is eerily close to what the ancient texts describe in their own terms. The really unsettling part of these ancient accounts is how they describe the decision-making process behind the flood. In the Sumerian version, the gods don't destroy humanity for being evil. They destroy humanity because humans were too numerous and too noisy, disrupting divine peace. Which, if we're being honest, sounds less like moral judgment and more like population control. The god Enlil, who pushes for the destruction, is basically described as being annoyed by humans breeding too successfully and making too much commotion. Ea/Enki opposes the plan and secretly warns Utnapishtim, leading to accusations from the other gods after the flood when they realize humans survived. There's divine politics, accusations of betrayal, and eventually a compromise where the gods agree to allow humans to continue existing but under certain constraints. This is not the narrative of an all-knowing, all-powerful single deity working out a redemption plan. This sounds like a committee of powerful beings with conflicting agendas making decisions about a species they created and now don't quite know what to do with. Again, either ancient people imagined this specific scenario purely from creativity, or they were preserving accounts of actual historical events involving beings or factions with advanced capabilities making decisions about human population. Let's talk about the technical specifications in these flood accounts, because this is where the stories get weirdly specific in ways that mythology usually doesn't bother with. The instructions for the Ark in various versions include dimensions, materials, structural design, waterproofing methods, ventilation systems, and internal layout. The Sumerian account describes the vessel as having multiple decks, reinforced corners, and specific coating materials to seal it. These aren't vague, build a big boat instructions. They're engineering specifications that would actually be necessary if you were trying to design a large floating structure capable of surviving catastrophic flood conditions while housing living organisms for an extended period. Why would mythological accounts include this level of technical detail? Myths usually focus on dramatic action and moral lessons, not construction specifications. The presence of these details suggests the accounts are based on actual events, where someone built something using specific techniques that worked, and the survival of that person or people depended on getting the engineering right. The aftermath of the flood in these ancient accounts is also revealing. When Utnapishtim's vessel finally comes to rest on a mountain, identified as Mount Nisir in the Sumerian version, Mount Ararat in the biblical version, he sends out birds to test whether the waters have receded enough to disembark. This is practical field biology, not divine inspiration. Someone who actually survived a flood scenario would need to determine when it's safe to leave their shelter, and releasing birds to see if they find land is a genuinely clever solution that doesn't require supernatural guidance. The text describes 3 birds being released. The first returns because it finds no resting place. The second returns with evidence of land. The third doesn't return at all. This is systematic testing, indicating the survivor had both knowledge and methodology for assessing environmental conditions. After disembarking, Utnapishtim makes a sacrifice that the gods smell and gather around like flies, which is either unflattering ancient poetry or a description of beings who were genuinely hungry after however long the catastrophe lasted and were drawn to the food preparation. The gods then argue about whether humans should have survived, and eventually grant Utnapishtim immortality as compensation for his ordeal, which is an oddly specific reward that requires explanation. The cross-cultural consistency of these flood narratives spanning different continents and civilizations is harder to explain away than most people realize. The Sumerians in Mesopotamia, the Hebrews who inherited their stories, the Greeks with Deucalion surviving Zeus's flood, the Hindu accounts of Manu being saved by a divine fish, the Native American traditions of world-ending floods in small groups of survivors, the Chinese legends of Gun Yu and the Great Floods, Aztec and Mayan flood mythologies. All of these describe the same basic pattern. Catastrophic flood, divine or natural causation, small number of survivors, rebuilding of civilization from that survivor group. Standard academic explanation attributes this to humans living near water where floods happen, so everyone independently invented similar stories. But that explanation struggles with the specifics. Why do so many accounts include advance warning, detailed survival preparations, divine involvement, or advanced beings providing help, and the theme of humanity needing to be destroyed and reset, rather than just natural disaster strike? The more parsimonious explanation is that all these cultures are preserving distorted memories of the same event, filtered through their own cultural and theological frameworks over thousands of years of oral and written transmission. So what's the actual truth here? Were the Anunnaki and similar beings described in ancient texts actual extraterrestrial visitors, survivors of an earlier advanced terrestrial civilization, or purely mythological constructs? Honestly, we don't have enough evidence to say definitively. What we can say is that the ancient texts describe events and beings with a level of specificity and technical detail that seems inconsistent with pure mythology. We can say that these descriptions show remarkable consistency across cultures that supposedly had no contact with each other. We can say that the genetic and geological evidence confirms something catastrophic happened around the time frame these texts describe. And we can say that if you were an ancient person trying to preserve accounts of technologically advanced beings who had capabilities beyond your understanding, you'd probably describe them using the language of gods and divine intervention because what other vocabulary did you have? Whether those beings were actually divine, extraterrestrial, or just the survivors of an earlier human civilization with advanced technology that got destroyed, the end result looks similar from the perspective of Bronze Age scribes trying to write it all down. The important point is that these aren't just random stories ancient people made up to entertain themselves. They're attempts to preserve historical memory of events that profoundly shaped human development. And dismissing them entirely as fiction means potentially ignoring important information about our own history that our ancestors considered vital, enough to write down and preserve through civilization-ending catastrophes. So we've covered ancient texts describing advanced beings, lost technologies, and genetic manipulation. Now let's talk about something that should be completely impossible, but exists anyway. Maps that show parts of the world that nobody in recorded history should have been able to map, drawn with accuracy that requires technology the ancients, supposedly, didn't have, depicting coastlines as they existed thousands of years before the maps were drawn. If that sounds confusing, good, because it should be. Welcome to the world of anomalous cartography, where medieval sea captains somehow had access to geographic knowledge that predates their entire civilization and makes modern historians extremely uncomfortable. Grab your compass, because we're about to navigate through some seriously strange historical artifacts that suggest someone mapped Earth comprehensively long before Columbus got lost looking for India. Let's start with the star of the show, the Piri-Reis map, discovered in 1929 in the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul. This map was drawn in 1513 by an Ottoman admiral and cartographer named Piri-Reis, who had a hobby of collecting and copying older maps he encountered during his naval campaigns. Nothing weird so far. Admirals making maps is pretty standard occupational behavior, like accountants making spreadsheets or YouTubers making thumbnails. But here's where things get absolutely bonkers. When scholars examined this map in detail and compared it to modern satellite imagery and geological surveys, they realized it shows the coastline of Antarctica. Not modern Antarctica covered in ice sheets, but Antarctica as it would have appeared more than 12,000 years ago before the ice covered it. The map shows mountains, bays, and coastal features that match the actual bedrock topography buried under miles of ice that we only discovered using ground-penetrating radar in the 20th century. So either Piri-Reis had a time machine, psychic powers, or access to source maps created by someone who actually saw Antarctica before it froze over, which officially shouldn't be possible because civilization supposedly didn't exist back then. Now, before skeptics start arguing that it's just a coincidence or misidentification, let's talk about the details. The map doesn't just vaguely resemble Antarctica in the way a cloud might look like a bunny if you squint. Multiple geographic features match with startling precision. The Queen Maudland coast, various mountain ranges, river mouths that are now under ice, even the approximate position and shape of the Antarctic Peninsula. Professor Charles Hapgood, who studied the map extensively in the 1960s, demonstrated that it showed the coastline before recent ice coverage, and that the projection used required knowledge of spherical trigonometry and accurate latitude and longitude measurements. Hapgood was a serious academic, not a conspiracy theorist. He literally wrote the book on ancient maps and crustal displacement theory, and his analysis concluded that the source maps Piri-Reis copied from must have been created by an advanced civilization with capabilities equivalent to aerial surveying, which is awkward for historians who insist that nobody had those capabilities until we invented airplanes in the 20th century. Piri-Reis himself, to his credit, didn't claim to have discovered or surveyed Antarctica personally. He openly admitted in notes on the map that he compiled it from approximately 20 different source maps, some of which dated back to ancient times. He specifically mentions using maps from the Library of Alexandria, the famous ancient repository of knowledge that burned down, taking with it who knows how many irreplaceable texts and documents. So according to Piri-Reis's own testimony, he was working from copies of ancient maps that showed geographic knowledge far beyond what those ancient civilizations should have possessed. It's like finding a medieval monk's manuscript that includes accurate blueprints for a smartphone. Technically possible if he copied it from even older sources, but raising serious questions about where that original knowledge came from and why nobody seems to remember the civilization that created it. The projection method used in the Piri-Reis map is itself worthy of discussion, because cartographers have analyzed it extensively and concluded it's sophisticated beyond what 16th century mapmakers typically used. The map appears to use a projection centered on what is now Cairo, Egypt, suggesting the original source mapmaker was based in or near that region. Converting a three-dimensional sphere into a two-dimensional map requires mathematical techniques that become progressively more complex depending on how accurate you want the result to be. The level of accuracy in the Piri-Reis map suggests the source cartographers understood spherical geometry, trigonometry, and had accurate instruments for measuring latitude, capabilities that took European civilizations centuries to develop during the Age of Exploration. Yet someone possessed these capabilities long before the ancient Egyptians supposedly built the pyramids, and their knowledge survived through the centuries in copied maps until it reached Piri-Reis, who didn't realize how impossible his source material actually was. But wait, there's more. Because the Piri-Reis map isn't alone in showing impossible geographic knowledge. The Orontius Phineus map, created in 1531, also shows Antarctica in remarkable detail, complete with interior features, river systems, and a generally ice-free continent. The Mercator map from 1569 depicts Antarctica as multiple landmasses separated by waterways, which seems wrong until you realize that under the current ice sheet, Antarctica is indeed multiple landmasses that would be separated by water if the ice melted. The Philippe Bloch map from 1737 shows Antarctica divided into two main landmasses separated by a waterway, which precisely matches what modern seismic surveys revealed lies beneath the ice. These cartographers were working centuries before anyone officially discovered Antarctica in the early 1800s. and yet their maps show features that match geological reality hidden under ice. Either every one of these map makers got incredibly lucky with their creative guesswork, or they were all copying from ancient source maps that showed Earth as it existed during a previous warm period before the Ice Age. The problem, from an orthodox historical perspective, is that Antarctica has been covered in ice for millions of years, according to standard geological timelines. But those timelines have been increasingly challenged by evidence of periodic ice-free periods during the relatively recent past. Core samples from the Ross Sea and other Antarctic regions show sediment layers suggesting ice-free conditions existed as recently as 6,000 to 15,000 years ago in some coastal areas. The geological evidence isn't conclusive enough to overturn the mainstream view, but it's concerning enough that some researchers are questioning whether Antarctica was entirely ice-covered during the period when the Younger Dryas was causing havoc everywhere else. If Antarctica was at least partially ice-free 12,000 to 15,000 years ago, then it's theoretically possible that a pre-flood civilization could have mapped it before the ice returned. Not probable according to current mainstream archaeology, but possible, and possibility is all we need to explain how these maps exist. Let's talk about what it would actually take to create maps this accurate of a continent-sized landmass. You can't just sail around the coast with a compass and call it good. You need multiple reference points, accurate latitude and longitude measurements, and preferably an aerial or orbital perspective to get the overall shape and proportions right. Columbus famously miscalculated distances and didn't realize he'd found a new continent because navigation in his era was still relatively primitive, despite all the progress made during the Age of Exploration. Yet the ancient source maps that Piri Reis copied from show geographic knowledge far superior to what Columbus and his contemporaries possessed. This implies the original map makers had either developed advanced surveying techniques we don't understand, or, more provocatively, had the ability to view Earth from above, either through aircraft, high-altitude balloons, or in the truly speculative scenarios, something even more advanced. The accuracy of these maps is consistent with aerial surveying, which is how we made accurate maps in the modern era before satellites. Without that elevated perspective, creating maps this precise of previously unknown territories is technically possible, but practically absurd in terms of the time and resources required. The Zeno map, dated to the late 1300s but purportedly based on even older sources, shows Greenland's coastline with features that weren't discovered until modern times. The map depicts Greenland not as a single landmass but as 3 separate islands, which is exactly what Greenland is under its ice sheet, as confirmed by modern ice-penetrating radar surveys. Whoever made the source maps for the Zeno map either had incredibly fortunate artistic intuition, or they were mapping Greenland during a period when the ice had retreated enough to reveal the actual underlying geography. The Dulcert Portolan from 1339 shows the Mediterranean with accuracy that rivals modern maps, which shouldn't be possible with medieval surveying technology, but there it is, existing and accurate. The Kamehameha map of the Pacific, based on ancient Polynesian sources, shows islands and navigation routes across vast oceanic distances, with accuracy that suggests the original Pacific navigators had mapping capabilities far beyond what historians typically credit them with. What makes all of this particularly interesting, and by interesting I mean should fundamentally change how we think about ancient history, is that many of these maps show coastlines and geographic features as they existed before the end of the last Ice Age, before sea levels rose and drowned vast coastal areas that are now underwater. The Piri Reis map shows parts of South America's coast that match the pre-flood shoreline better than the modern coast. Ancient maps of the Mediterranean sometimes show islands and coastal features that are now submerged but match the seafloor topography. Maps of Northern Europe occasionally show land bridges and coastal features that only existed when sea levels were lower during the Ice Age. This isn't just interesting trivia. This is evidence that someone was mapping Earth comprehensively during or immediately before the great flood events we've been discussing. Someone saw these coastlines before they were submerged, recorded them with sufficient accuracy that the knowledge survived through millennia of copying and recopying, and left us with maps that contradict the official timeline of human civilization. The standard academic response to these anomalous maps has been a combination of skepticism, dismissal, and creative reinterpretation. Some scholars argue that the resemblance to Antarctica is coincidental, or that the maps show other regions misidentified as Antarctica. Others suggest the maps are frauds or modern creations passed off as ancient documents. The problem with these explanations is that many of these maps have impeccable provenance. They're genuine historical artifacts whose age isn't in dispute. housed in legitimate museums and libraries, studied by professional cartographers who confirm they're authentic period documents. The Piri Reis map was authenticated by Ottoman scholars and has been in the Topkapi Palace archive since the 16th century. You can't just wave that away as fraud. The more honest academic position is to admit we don't fully understand where the geographic knowledge in these maps came from, but acknowledge that dismissing them entirely means ignoring physical evidence that doesn't fit our preferred historical narrative. So who created the original maps that these medieval and Renaissance cartographers were copying from? The most straightforward explanation is that a pre-flood civilization, possessing advanced surveying and navigation capabilities, conducted a comprehensive mapping project of Earth's coastlines and major landmasses. This civilization would need several key capabilities: mathematical knowledge to handle projections and coordinate systems, instruments for accurate measurement of position and elevation, transportation technology to reach all the mapped locations, including remote islands and polar regions, and most importantly, either an elevated viewing perspective or extremely sophisticated ground-based surveying methods to achieve the level of accuracy demonstrated. Whether this civilization was based in Antarctica before it froze, in now submerged coastal regions around the world, or somewhere else entirely, they left behind cartographic knowledge that survived their destruction and gradually propagated through human societies that rebuilt after the catastrophe. The alternative explanation, favored by ancient astronaut theorists and thoroughly despised by mainstream academics, is that the mapping was conducted by visitors with advanced technology, either extraterrestrial beings, time travelers, or some other exotic option that requires capabilities beyond known human history. While this explanation has the advantage of easily accounting for the advanced technology required, it has the disadvantage of being completely unprovable and requiring us to accept the existence of beings or capabilities we have no other evidence for. The terrestrial pre-flood civilization explanation requires fewer exotic assumptions. We just need to accept that humans developed advanced capabilities earlier than we thought, lost them in a catastrophe, and spent the next 10,000 years gradually rebuilding. That's strange enough to make historians uncomfortable, but doesn't require invoking aliens or time machines. What's particularly intriguing is that these maps might not just be geographical records. They might be warnings or instructions from survivors. If you knew your civilization was about to be destroyed by rising sea levels and wanted to preserve knowledge for whoever came after, creating maps showing what the world looked like before the flood would be incredibly valuable. Future generations could use these maps to identify now submerged locations where ancient cities and knowledge repositories might still exist underwater. They could understand which areas were safe from flooding and which weren't. They could see the true extent of the catastrophe by comparing the pre-flood maps to their own geography. Ancient cartographers might have been copying these maps not just for navigation, but because they recognized them as important historical documents, even if they didn't fully understand their significance. The maps are artifacts of a lost world, preserved through generations by people who understood that this knowledge was precious, even if they couldn't fully explain why. The existence of these impossible maps has implications that extend far beyond just, "Isn't that neat?" If pre-flood civilizations had the capability to conduct planetary-scale surveying and mapping projects, they almost certainly had other advanced capabilities we haven't discovered yet. Navigation, mathematics, astronomy, potentially aviation, or at minimum very sophisticated ocean-going vessels. All of these would be necessary supporting technologies for a civilization capable of creating accurate world maps. Every one of these anomalous maps is evidence not just of geographic knowledge, but of a technological capability that shouldn't have existed according to our current understanding of ancient history. They're proof that someone, somewhere, possessed advanced capabilities that got lost in the catastrophe and only partially recovered. And if they had mapping technology this sophisticated, what else did they have that we haven't rediscovered yet? The maps also raise uncomfortable questions about historical transmission of knowledge. How exactly did these maps survive from pre-flood times through the catastrophe and into later civilizations? Someone had to preserve them, protect them through the disaster, and then ensure they continued to be copied and distributed so the knowledge wouldn't be lost. This suggests intentional knowledge preservation by survivors who understood the value of what they possessed. It implies a continuity of sophisticated civilization through the catastrophe. Not everyone died, not all knowledge was lost, and the survivors made deliberate efforts to preserve and pass down what they could. These maps might be part of a larger body of preserved knowledge, most of which has been lost to decay and time, with only these cartographic fragments surviving because maps kept being useful and therefore kept being copied by later civilizations, who valued them for navigation even without understanding their true origin or significance. In the end, the impossible maps are exactly what their name suggests. They're impossible according to standard historical timelines, yet they exist. They show knowledge that shouldn't have been available when they were drawn, depict geographic features that were discovered centuries or millennia later, and demonstrate technical capabilities that supposedly didn't develop until modern time. They're physical evidence, authenticated by mainstream historians and cartographers, that something is wrong with our understanding of ancient history. Whether that means accepting the existence of pre-flood advanced civilizations, reconsidering the timeline of ice coverage in polar regions, or acknowledging that ancient peoples had capabilities we've underestimated, these maps demand explanation. You can dismiss ancient texts as mythology, argue about the interpretation of archaeological sites, debate what genetic evidence really proves, but maps are hard to argue with. They show specific, verifiable geographic information that someone, somehow, obtained and recorded long before it should have been possible. That's not speculation or interpretation. That's documented fact on parchment and paper, sitting in museums and libraries, waiting for historians to develop explanations that actually account for their existence, instead of just wishing they'd go away. We've established that ancient civilizations had advanced mapping capabilities, sophisticated technologies, and detailed knowledge about a global catastrophe. Now here's the really unsettling question. Did they also know these catastrophes were cyclical and could predict when the next one would hit? Because when you examine ancient astronomical monuments and calendrical systems from cultures around the world, a disturbing pattern emerges. These people weren't just casually stargazing because the night sky looked pretty. They were obsessively tracking cosmic cycles spanning thousands of years, encoding warnings about periodic destructions, and building monuments designed to outlast civilizations specifically to preserve this knowledge. It's like they were trying to leave us a cosmic alarm clock set for catastrophe incoming. Except the alarm is written in stone monuments we've been mostly ignoring, because we thought they were just temples or art installations. Let's start with the big one, precession of the equinoxes, which is probably the most important astronomical phenomenon you've never heard of unless you're really into archaeoastronomy or happen to be a 2,000-year-old Egyptian priest. Here's what's happening. Earth's axis wobbles like a slightly unbalanced spinning top, completing one full wobble cycle approximately every 26,000 years. This wobble causes the position of the celestial poles to slowly shift, which means the stars that appear directly above Earth's poles change over time, and the constellation the sun rises in during the spring equinox gradually moves through all 12 zodiac constellations over the full cycle. Modern science figured this out in the 2nd century BC when Hipparchus calculated it, though he probably wasn't the first to notice, since he was building on earlier observations. The ancient Egyptians, Babylonians, Maya, and others all knew about precession thousands of years earlier, which is weird because you need centuries of careful astronomical observation to detect a movement this slow. It's like measuring continental drift with a ruler. Technically possible if you're patient enough, but requiring institutional continuity and record-keeping that supposedly didn't exist yet. Why should we care about this slow wobble of Earth's axis? Because multiple ancient cultures encoded precession into their monuments, calendars, and myths in ways that suggest they believed this cycle was tied to catastrophic events. The ancient concept of the Great Year, a period of roughly 26,000 years, appears across different cultures with disturbingly similar characteristics. The Greeks wrote about the Great Year as a cycle after which everything returns to its starting point, often associated with periodic destructions and rebirths of civilization. Plato discusses cycles of catastrophe separated by thousands of years. Hindu texts describe vast cycles of time called yugas, with humanity going through periods of rise and fall. The Maya had multiple interlocking calendar systems tracking cycles from days up to periods spanning thousands of years, all converging on specific dates they considered significant for cosmic reasons. Either every ancient culture independently decided to obsess over the same astronomical cycle and associate it with destruction for no particular reason, or they all inherited this knowledge from a common source that had learned the hard way that the Great Year wasn't just an interesting astronomical curiosity. It marked real, repeating cosmic dangers. The Dendera zodiac from Egypt is particularly interesting in this context. It's a ceiling decoration from the Temple of Hathor showing the constellations and planetary positions in a circular arrangement that depicts the precession cycle. But it's not just decorative art. It's a sophisticated astronomical map encoding thousands of years of sky observations and appears to mark significant positions in the precessional cycle. The age of the zodiac has been debated extensively, with some researchers arguing it depicts sky positions from over 12,000 years ago, though mainstream Egyptologists insist it's from the Ptolemaic period around 50 BC. Even if we accept the conservative dating, the question remains, why were Egyptian priests in 50 BC so concerned with tracking a cycle that takes 26,000 years to complete? That's not practical astronomy for agriculture or navigation. That's long-term cosmic monitoring, the kind of thing you do when you're convinced something important happens at specific points in the cycle and you want to warn people about it. It's the ancient equivalent of NASA tracking near-Earth asteroids. You don't do it for fun. You do it because you think there's an actual threat worth monitoring. The Great Sphinx might be another precessional marker, according to researchers like Robert Bouval and Graham Hancock, who've analyzed its astronomical alignments. The Sphinx faces due east, staring at the point where the sun rises on the equinox. Currently, it watches the sun rise in Pisces, but due to precession, the constellation changes slowly over millennia. Around 10,500 BC, right in the time frame of the Younger Dryas catastrophe, the Sphinx would have watched the sun rise in Leo, the lion constellation. And what is the Sphinx? A lion. Coincidence? Maybe. Or maybe the Sphinx was built to mark a specific moment in the precessional cycle, serving as a permanent reminder of when something significant happened, like, say, a civilization-destroying catastrophe. If you wanted to warn future generations about cosmic cycles and catastrophic events, building a massive stone monument aligned to a specific astronomical configuration that only occurs every 26,000 years would be a pretty effective way to do it. You can't burn stone lions or accidentally delete them from the cloud. They just sit there for millennia, waiting for someone smart enough to figure out what they're pointing at. The Maya calendar system is perhaps the most sophisticated example of ancient astronomical obsession, featuring multiple interlocking cycles that track time from individual days up to periods spanning thousands of years. The long count calendar, which famously completed a major cycle in 2012, causing brief worldwide panic among people who apparently never read the actual Maya texts, tracked periods called baktuns, each lasting about 394 years, with 13 baktuns, making up a complete cycle of roughly 5,125 years. But the Maya didn't just track this cycle randomly. They recorded major historical events, astronomical phenomena, and mythological destructions in reference to these calendrical positions, suggesting they believed the cycle completion was cosmically significant. The 2012 date passed without Earth exploding, which disappointed apocalypse enthusiasts and relieved everyone else. But the Maya never actually predicted the world would end then. They predicted the end of one cycle and the beginning of another, which, in their worldview, was associated with change and potential upheaval, but not necessarily total destruction. The point is, they were tracking these massive time periods for a reason, and that reason seems to be connected to their belief in cyclical catastrophes. Let's talk about what could actually cause cyclical catastrophes tied to astronomical phenomena, because this isn't just ancient superstition. There are plausible physical mechanisms. The solar system passes through different regions of space as it orbits the galactic center, encountering varying densities of cosmic dust, radiation, and potentially debris fields from ancient comet breakups. Some researchers propose that Earth periodically crosses paths with meteor streams or comet swarms that orbit the Sun in elongated elliptical patterns, meaning we encounter them at regular intervals, as both Earth and the debris field complete their respective orbits. If the Younger Dryas impact event was caused by comet fragments hitting Earth, and if those fragments came from a larger comet that broke up in the inner solar system, then the remaining debris might still be orbiting out there, crossing Earth's path on a predictable schedule. Ancient astronomers who witnessed one impact event and understood basic orbital mechanics could theoretically calculate when Earth might encounter that debris field again, giving them a reason to track cycles spanning thousands of years and encode warnings about when to expect the next cosmic bombardment. The Taurid meteor stream is particularly interesting in this context. Earth passes through the Taurid stream twice a year, producing relatively modest meteor showers that most people don't pay much attention to because they're not as spectacular as events like the Perseids. But astronomers have detected that the Taurid stream contains significantly larger objects than typical meteor debris, We're talking asteroids and comet fragments big enough to survive atmospheric entry and cause serious damage. Some researchers, including the late astronomer Victor Klube and his colleague Bill Napier, proposed that the torrid stream is the remnant of a giant comet that broke up within the past 20,000 to 30,000 years, spreading debris across a vast region of space that Earth periodically travels through. The density of dangerous objects in the stream varies depending on where Earth intersects it, meaning some passes are more hazardous than others. If the Younger Dryas impacts came from the torrid stream during a particularly dense encounter, and if that density varies on a predictable cycle, then ancient astronomers could have been tracking Earth's position relative to this threat, using the precessional cycle and other astronomical periods as a framework for predicting when we're due for another dangerous passage. Stonehenge, that famous circle of massive stones in England that tourists love to photograph and archaeologists love to argue about, is fundamentally an astronomical observatory. The monument aligns with the summer and winter solstices, tracks lunar cycles including the 18.6-year lunar standstill cycle, and appears to have been designed to predict eclipses. Why would Neolithic people invest enormous effort building a permanent astronomical calculator? Standard explanation: religious and agricultural purposes. Knowing when seasons change helps with farming, but you don't need a massive stone computer to figure out when to plant crops. You need a stone computer when you're tracking multiple complex astronomical cycles over long periods, for reasons important enough to justify the massive investment of resources. Stonehenge could predict eclipses, which is impressive but also suspicious. Why do you need to predict eclipses unless you think they're connected to something dangerous? Many ancient cultures associated eclipses with catastrophic events, divine displeasure, or cosmic upheavals. If eclipses occasionally coincided with meteor impacts or other disasters, which is statistically possible given enough time, then tracking eclipse cycles becomes a way of monitoring potential threat windows. You're essentially checking whether certain astronomical configurations correlate with increased danger, which is actually decent empirical science if you've got millennia of observational data to work with. The Antikythera mechanism, discovered in a shipwreck off the Greek island of Antikythera in 1901, throws a massive wrench into our understanding of ancient astronomical capabilities. This device, dated to around 100 BC, is a sophisticated mechanical computer using bronze gears to track the movements of the sun, moon, and planets, predict eclipses, and calculate the timing of the Olympic Games. When researchers finally figured out how it worked using modern imaging technology, they were stunned by its complexity. It's essentially a clockwork computer that wouldn't be matched in sophistication until medieval European clockmakers developed similar devices over 1,000 years later. The existence of the Antikythera mechanism proves that ancient Greeks had the mathematical and mechanical knowledge to build precision instruments for astronomical tracking far beyond what historians typically credit them with. If the Greeks in 100 BC could build this, what could earlier civilizations with potentially more advanced knowledge have built? And crucially, why were they so interested in tracking astronomical cycles with such precision, unless they believed those cycles were important for predicting something significant, like when cosmic threats might return? Here's where we get into truly speculative but weirdly consistent territory. Multiple ancient cultures describe previous destructions of humanity before the most recent flood. Hindu texts describe multiple cycles of creation and destruction spanning millions of years. Hopi traditions describe humanity emerging from previous worlds that were destroyed, with the current world being the fourth or fifth iteration depending on which version you hear. Greek mythology describes multiple ages of humanity: Golden Age, Silver Age, Bronze Age, each ending in catastrophic destruction before the next begins. The biblical and Mesopotamian flood narratives acknowledge other major events before Noah, including the casting out of rebellious angels and the destruction of cities. If these accounts are preserving distorted memories of actual cyclical catastrophes, then the flood approximately 12,000 years ago wasn't a unique event, but one iteration in a series of periodic cosmic disasters that have hit Earth multiple times throughout human existence. Ancient astronomers would have been attempting to figure out the timing of these cycles not out of academic curiosity, but out of survival necessity. If catastrophes repeat on schedule, then predicting the schedule becomes the most important scientific project imaginable. The galactic alignment theories, popular among alternative researchers, propose that the solar system's position relative to the galactic plane varies over time as we orbit the Milky Way's center, and that crossing the galactic plane might expose Earth to increased cosmic radiation or gravitational effects that could trigger catastrophes. The math on this is complicated and disputed. Mainstream astronomers generally think the effects would be minimal or undetectable. But the interesting part isn't whether the galactic alignment theory is correct. It's that ancient Maya astronomers appear to have been tracking these massive cosmic cycles and considered certain alignments significant. They couldn't have known about the galactic center in modern astronomical terms, but they might have observed that certain sky configurations correlated with increased meteor activity, unusual weather patterns, or other phenomena they considered dangerous. If you observe the sky carefully for centuries and notice that bad things tend to happen when the stars are in certain positions, you don't need to understand the underlying astrophysics to conclude that those positions are worth monitoring and warning people about. The mythology of the axis mundi, or world axis, appears across cultures, the concept of a cosmic pole or center around which the heavens rotate. The ancient Egyptians associated this with the polar stars. The Maya tracked it through their ceremonial alignments. Hindu cosmology describes Mount Meru as the cosmic axis. Norse mythology has Yggdrasil, the world tree connecting different realms. Modern interpretation treats these as purely symbolic or religious concepts. But there's an astronomical reality underlying the symbolism. Earth's rotational axis does point at different stars over the precessional cycle, and the celestial poles appear to shift from an Earth-based perspective. If ancient astronomers understood that Earth's axis wobbles, and that this wobble correlates with cyclical catastrophes, either because the axial position affects Earth's vulnerability to cosmic impacts, or because the precessional cycle happens to coincide with other orbital factors, then encoding this knowledge in religious symbolism about the world axis makes perfect sense. You're teaching people to track something important using the most memorable metaphors and stories available, ensuring the knowledge survives even if the civilization that discovered it doesn't. Modern astronomy, for what it's worth, does acknowledge that Earth faces periodic increased risks from cosmic impacts. We know that asteroid and comet impacts have occurred throughout Earth's history, including relatively recent major events like the Tunguska explosion in 1908 and the Chelyabinsk meteor in 2013, both of which were relatively small objects that could have caused catastrophic damage if they'd hit populated areas or at slightly different angles. NASA and other space agencies maintain programs to detect and track potentially hazardous near-Earth objects, and estimates suggest we've only identified a fraction of the objects large enough to cause regional or global damage. The question isn't whether cosmic impacts are a real threat. They demonstrably are. The question is whether these impacts follow any predictable patterns that ancient astronomers could have detected and encoded into their monuments and calendrical systems. If Earth's orbit periodically crosses dense regions of the torrid stream or other debris fields on a schedule lasting thousands of years, then tracking that schedule becomes critically important, and suddenly ancient astronomical obsessions start, looking less like superstition and more like prehistoric disaster preparedness. The uncomfortable implication of all this astronomical evidence is that ancient cultures might have been correct about catastrophes being cyclical and potentially predictable. We've dismissed their warnings as mythology because we couldn't imagine how they'd know about cosmic cycles without modern technology. But what if they knew, because they'd lived through previous catastrophes, maintained observational records across generations, and detected patterns that we're only now beginning to rediscover using satellites and computer modeling? The monuments they built weren't just religious temples. They were data storage devices, astronomical computers, and warning systems designed to survive catastrophes and preserve knowledge for whoever came after. We've been treating them like primitive art installations, when they might actually be sophisticated scientific instruments, encoding information about cosmic threats. And if those ancient astronomers were correct about the cycles they tracked, if the catastrophes really do repeat on schedule, then we might want to pay more attention to what their monuments are trying to tell us about when the next one is due. Because if the cycle continues, and if we're approaching another cosmic bombardment similar to what happened during the Younger Dryas, then the ancient warnings encoded in stone circles and temple alignments aren't mythology. They're disaster preparedness from people who survived the unsurvivable and wanted us to be ready when our turn comes.